aware, I don't want to get this to be a big distraction of our panel, and I know, Ilse, Mars has been in the news a bit lately, and I just want to get this out of the way because it's been in the news for sort of the wrong reasons in terms of lots of discussion about government bailout of a tower that you built and so forth. Can you just clarify where we are with that and how that fitted into your, generally what you are as Mars?
Most of what you've read in the news is incorrect, but the simple history is that having successfully, with mostly private financing, developed phase 1 of Mars, Mars is a nonprofit, we decided we needed a private sector partner to develop phase 2. We ran an international RFP and hired, out of that process, the top developer of life sciences type clusters in North America, who started construction on phase 2, which many of you know as the corner of college and university. And then because of the global recession, global financial crisis, stopped the project right at grade level at the end of 2008. And so we then embarked on a process of trying to figure out how we meet the growing demand. We also had one particular tenant, Public Health Ontario, which was created post-SARS in Toronto as a absolutely critical piece of infrastructure we need to beef up our capacity to respond to global infectious diseases that had then been put on hold because of the pause. And after 3 years with no visibility on when the project would restart, we recommenced. Mars took over the project again, and again as a nonprofit with a loan from Infrastructure Ontario, fully secured against the building with interest. Completed the project, and what's happened over the last year, which is very unfortunate, is we just have a misalignment of interests. And when you look at under the hood, we're doing a pretty traditional real estate thing of buying out our American partner so that we can have a Made in Canada solution. The building is oversubscribed. As soon as this restructuring is complete, which we hope will be before the end of the year, the building will be full of innovation tenants doing the stuff that's important and that we heard about lots today.
Great, well, thank you for clarifying that. I just wanted to then take a step back and say, what are the problems here with entrepreneurship and the ecosystem of entrepreneurship that you are hoping to tackle with the establishment and growth of Mars?
I would say Mars was created by a group of business leaders in Canada, philanthropists working with leaders in academia and the community for two main purposes, and I think those two goals are still at the heart of what we're trying to do. The first is we know that we have in Canada very significant strength in academic research, and particularly in the life sciences space. We know that we have a density problem, if you want, in Canada. We're a big floppy country, 30 million people, spread pretty thin. But one of our unique assets is here in downtown Toronto, literally in 10 city blocks. We spend $1.5 billion a year on research, and we have one of the top performing and most productive research clusters. We have not traditionally performed well enough on commercializing the best discoveries coming out of that research infrastructure. So that was one of the goals that certainly we were created to tackle. The second one was, when you look per capita, we do pretty well in Canada in terms of starting companies, but not enough of our companies grow big. And that was the second challenge, is how do we get more of those companies beyond this sort of, just lifestyle businesses and get them to scale. And that's where we, I think, deal with some of the sort of, unique challenges of our geography and our local market size. And
so what do you feel is the biggest barrier to scaling up and achieving? I mean, we heard from Rupert earlier that it might be just a lack of ambition at some level, but is it more than that?
That's sort of a big, hairy challenge to tackle. I think there's a much more practical one, which is the lack of availability of smart risk capital that will invest in these businesses early. The data is pretty clear. We typically give our companies 1/3 of the capital in the early stages that their competitors south of the border would get, which means we're really good at that sort of technology development phase, and we get there pretty cost effectively. But once those companies go into market, they really need gas in the tank. So that's one challenge. And the second challenge is the local market is small and fragmented over this large geography. So for these companies, their first customer, their market-making customer is not in Canada. So they really have to be global companies from the day they're born in the technology space, and doing that with still a maturing ecosystem of serial entrepreneurs and 1/3 of the money in the bank is a challenge.
Now, Katherine, as you look back home from Silicon Valley, I mean, what do you think are what are the most striking absences in Canada that you see working well in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, so I'm co-chair of C100. It's the largest Canadian tech expat group. It's based out of Silicon Valley. And so we spent a lot of time helping to sort of support and accelerate the next generation of Canadian tech entrepreneurs. We started that group about 5 years ago or so, and I've seen a pretty dramatic change over the last 5 years. I don't think that lack of ambition is an issue. I see some there's an entrepreneur here today who literally came up to me and he said, I came here today to see you. This is what I'm doing with my company. Would love to tell you more about it. I'm like, awesome. That's no lack of ambition, right? So I think where we sort of started was early stage, like Ilse said. You got kind of the foundations, 101, how do you get a company started, et cetera. Seen a ton of change there, right? There's Section 116 was taken away out of the tax code in 2009. There's a startup visa program here. There's a whole new generation now of entrepreneurs coming through. I don't know if you're familiar with Velocity out of Communitech, but they've had, I think now 10 companies go down to the Y Combinator incubator out of Silicon Valley, which is one of the top-notch incubators. Most of them have come back up here. I mean, that was not happening 5 years ago. There's a whole new generation of investors now, Real Ventures, Inovia, Boris Wirtz and his firm Version 1. I mean, there's been a dramatic change. So I think, and then you've got communities like, you've got Mars, you've got Communitech, a lot of these technology hubs. There are new hubs starting around smaller areas like Kelowna. Lane Merrifield, the co-founder of Club Penguin, has a tech hub that he's building out there. I know on the East Coast they've got a tech hub. I just met with the Quebec mayor and a group coming through. They want to create a tech hub. So I feel like kind of getting the company started, there's a whole sort of new wave of energy and resources being put towards that. I think one thing that I see that could actually potentially happen there still is more angel investing. So maybe tax incentives for angel investors locally, that's one thing that could happen there. Next is the scaling, completely agree. I think that's actually, frankly, now where the bigger problem is. We've had some great success stories here in Canada. You had, Eloqua acquired by Oracle for $800 million, Taleo acquired by Oracle for $2 billion. These are all Canadian companies. Radian6 acquired for about $300 million. I mean, these are amazing success stories. We need to have more of them, right? BlackBerry has had its issues, but we need to have 20 to 30 of them. And to scale a company, what I see lacking is a kind of a combination of not having enough of the experienced executives who've seen the movie before to help scale the companies. So that's those who've done it here before have got to give back. The joke kind of goes that, the successful entrepreneurs go buy a cottage and a boat, and they're gone from the ecosystem. So we got to have people who, start giving back to the ecosystem, whether it's as an advisor, a mentor, an executive again, or an investor, et cetera. But we also need to be able to bring in, I think, more efficiently and easier executives from other areas, in certain functional areas from Silicon Valley. And so, we need to work with the federal government in helping to accelerate the visa process there, because a number of the companies, including Shopify, I know, have issues with that. And I think the third, and then I think just, a real connection, like a bridge between areas like Silicon Valley. 5 years ago, there was a lot of emphasis on brain drain. I feel like there's a lot less emphasis there now, that we see ourselves not as a brain drain, but as a brain flow. We're helping to accelerate innovation and the exchange of entrepreneurship between Canada and Silicon Valley. The third area that we're focusing on with C100 is then the larger companies here. How do you accelerate innovation within those companies? So we have a bunch of innovation, we're calling them programs, where we're bringing companies like Magna and Air Canada and a bunch of large companies down to Silicon Valley and trying to sort of stimulate broader thinking in terms of how can we innovate here in Canada. And so, again, that bridge between Silicon Valley and other areas of innovation, I think, is important. But also, another idea that it's actually a couple of local investors here had was, why don't we try to get, entrepreneurs or technologists or younger people on the boards of some of these companies too, again, to just try and foster innovation. So.
Now, Lauren, tell us a bit about TalentEgg and how you came to start it and the process of actually doing a Canadian startup.
Sure. So, in a nutshell, TalentEgg is an online platform that addresses youth employment. The story of how I started TalentEgg is basically that I was a frustrated recent graduate. I went to Queen's. I was an economics student. And as I approached graduation, I realized that it was very difficult to find meaningful employment afterwards. I decided to go to London, England, where I did my master's at the London School of Economics, and I found that in the UK, the environment for youth employment and that transition from school to work was a much more beaten path. The environment was very different. It was very much more receptive to recent graduates and offering them meaningful employment. And on the one hand, it was because employers there were much more open to providing training to recent graduates from all different backgrounds, which is very different than in Canada, where many employers focus just on business and engineering grads. And the other was because they saw these great uses of technology, of digital platforms to help connect students with meaningful employment opportunities and employers with students that were looking for those opportunities. I wrote a business plan, found that a model like that could work in Canada, and came to Canada, adapted the model to work here. And so, the idea is that we're providing a platform that levels the playing field for students, that helps them get the resources and the information and the access that they didn't have before, and working with employers and really sort of lobbying employers to create better programs to help students make that transition successfully from school to work. And so it sounds like a social entrepreneurship venture, and you could call it that. It's also a business, and a successful business, and a bootstrap startup.
And you say it's a bootstrap startup. I mean, how in practice, how easy or difficult was it? Were there to get started? Were there particular things you felt you could have had more help on from the ecosystem?
I think you always think you could have more help. I think as a recent grad, as a young entrepreneur, I was 24 years old. A lot of people were willing to help me at the time. There were, everybody had advice and would open their doors, was available for coffee. I worked with the CYBF, or Futurepreneur. So when I say we were bootstrapped, we actually had a $15,000 loan, if you want to call that financing. Sorry, I left that out. But it was actually helpful, and it was great discipline. For building a business. So for going there are lots of businesses that need to start with raising capital, but there are a lot of businesses today, especially in the tech world, especially in the online media world, that don't require a hefty investment up front. And so the discipline of having to go out and sell so that I could pay myself, so that I could pay the people that were working with me, was very good for the starting phase of the business. As I mentioned when we were speaking before, I think that over time you get to a maturity point as an entrepreneur where you are ready to receive capital, and you can understand how to take that, million, 2 million, whatever it is, and turn it into 10 or 100 times that. And I think that's where we are today, but we weren't there a couple of years ago.
So as you now look at potentially raising that kind of money, is there a lot of supply there, do you think? Or?
It's interesting because I think as an entrepreneur, I've recognized that that's not necessarily my area of expertise. So we've actually partnered with a small investment bank that's working out of Mars to help us figure out, how we can navigate those paths. And I was speaking to them before I came here today, just to get some insight on what they're seeing in the entrepreneurial world in terms of raising money. And I think that both of you have touched on it, is that there is less VC money available out there than in Canada than there is, let's say even in the US, but it is growing, and it has improved even in the past couple of years. And one of the comments that I thought was really interesting from one of the partners in the firm, he said that he thinks that one of the biggest barriers to growth for small companies in Canada, for entrepreneurial companies in Canada, is that when they reach a point where they want to raise funds, sometimes the only way to do it, the best way to do it for them, is to go public. And so instead of having a couple of VC investors or private investors that are almost involved in the day-to-day, they almost act like mentors or coaches or advisors in the business, you have shareholders. And that's a very different dynamic. It's not as good for the business. The expectations aren't very good for the growth of the business, et cetera.
Now, Katherine, from what you were saying, the picture has changed quite dramatically in the last 5 years. Does it now feel like, actually, if we roll it forward 5 years, there's enough momentum here that we won't be asking this question anymore, or are there still some things that are in play?
Yeah, well, my hope is that it continues to get better and better. And again, it really has to be an entire ecosystem, right? It's got to all be moving together. So it's not just financing, it's not just government, it's literally the entire ecosystem has got to be continuing to grow.
And you don't see that yet in place?
Yeah, I've definitely seen it over the last 5 years. But in terms of financing, there's a lot more, for better or worse, there's a lot more money from the US coming into Canada now too. We've been able to, through C100, track now over $1 billion in funding from US venture firms coming in across the border. A lot of that is because of getting rid of Section 116. It's way easier for us in terms of cost and paperwork in the US to invest in Canada now. But what needs to happen though is to have very senior, experienced investors on the ground here, entrepreneurs on the ground who've seen the movie before, who've done it before, get the executives in to help scale the companies who've seen it, done it before, get the money both here as well as coming in from Silicon Valley and other parts, working together to scale the companies. It's got to be everyone working together. So I think it's going to continue to keep getting better.
How do you feel about that, Ilse? Are you as upbeat as Katherine?
No, I think we have seen a huge sea change in the last 5 years. I would say it's still uneven in terms of sectors. Much more money for software companies or ICT companies than for healthcare companies, for example, or physical sciences. Clean tech, energy was a big topic today, where we see extraordinary innovation. I have to say, I am so optimistic about we talked about ambition of entrepreneurs. Our clean tech entrepreneurs are shooting for the moon. They have big, bold ideas, but it's tough for them to raise capital. So I think that's, that there's a misalignment with where our unique differentiated strengths are, which I think are in the life sciences and physical sciences, and the capital that's available locally. I would also say there's the other thing that I'm very optimistic about, which is a new shift and has a little bit to do with some of the challenges in the US, is we are seeing a big change in the focus of entrepreneurs in terms of markets and where they're looking to source capital. So just in the Greater Toronto area, enormous diversity in terms of diaspora entrepreneurs, and where historically tech entrepreneurs focused almost exclusively on the US market, both for customers but also for capital. We are now seeing these entrepreneurs building products for Brazil, building products for China, because that's where they come from, that's where they have relationships, and actually quite a different picture emerging, where they raise capital from brand name US firms, but they raise it in China. So I think the opportunity for Canada actually is potentially, if we can convert this diversity into an economic strategy and be much more focused on how do we support some of these young companies into emerging markets. And I think we heard from Ed Clark a little bit, slipstream them perhaps behind some of the more mature companies that are already making headway in those markets. There's a very unique differentiated opportunity for Canada there, and that's where the entrepreneurial capacity here is really, really strong. Now,
Ed Clark also mentioned this idea of seeing Massachusetts as the competition, and that education and healthcare are often seen here still as a liability rather than an asset. And I mean, how far and what can be done to actually improve the ability of people in the healthcare and the education system to actually be entrepreneurial with the things that they're doing? What do we need to do?
I think he absolutely put his finger on. I mean, historically, we have treated our healthcare system as a thing that takes care of sick people, but we spend half of our provincial budget on our healthcare system. We've never really thought of it or used it as an economic instrument. So, and that is actually, we've over the last 3-4 years really started to focus on how do we actually create a pathway for young Canadian companies to validate their technology in areas like energy, in areas like healthcare, in the education system. Our companies, it's easier for them to sell their products in China than to sell it to the Toronto District School Board. Makes me crazy, right? So part of this cultural transformation is to become better adopters of our own technology and use those systems to act as a springboard and a validator for some of these technologies so that they can then go global. Because, if that doesn't happen, they have to go global anyway. And the first question they get is, well, is Ontario Hydro buying your thing? And if the answer is no, we just make it much, much harder. So we now have specific programs targeted at those, at those markets. And just in the education sector, which is one example, we have about 160 young companies at Mars right now doing innovations in education. And really what you're seeing is a shift from, we have a lot of curriculum experts, we have a lot of education entrepreneurs who really have worked in the system but have never really thought of themselves as building education enterprises. But because there's such a market pull now for those edutech or education companies, we're seeing just a proliferation because there's a huge market need for that. And I think that's one of our opportunities, is to actually just begin to think about how do we actually productize what we know in terms of how to run a healthcare system, how to run a public education system, which are systems that are some of the best in the world.
Katherine, I mean, in Silicon Valley, I mean, there seems to be a great ability to get academics, to actually get their ideas to market. I mean, what lessons do you think there are from that for Canada?
Yeah, I actually just gave a talk on that recently. So I got my grad degree at Stanford, and one of the things that struck me there was just how integrated with industry the programs were, both in class, but I was also part of a group called BASES. It's the Business Association of, used to be engineering, but now entrepreneurship students. And we got to work directly with, so I helped to run the business plan competition. I worked directly with top entrepreneurs and top venture capitalists on Sand Hill Road who would come onto campus, and they'd spend hours providing feedback for the student startups. We had an entrepreneurial thought leader speaker series where we literally had the CEOs of the top companies in Silicon Valley coming in, spending 2 hours every Wednesday saying, I used to be in your seat, this is what I did from your seat to where I am today. It was unbelievably inspiring, but also gave you this interesting roadmap, right? To be able to get to kind of, this is what you can do, but this is how you can do it. And I think it goes all the way back to the roots of Silicon Valley. Fred Terman out of the School of Engineering, he was the one who really got a lot of government funding in to sponsor innovation. He was doing a lot of sort of radar technologies, and Hewlett-Packard spun out of his group. And you can just see a lot of the innovations that have sort of spun out from professors like Terman who recognize the importance of commercialization. And I think one of the other shifts I've seen in Canada that's relevant for this is that we've had a lot in the past of amazing scientists and engineers, but that doesn't mean an entrepreneur. That doesn't mean that person is going to be able to commercialize anything. Let me tell you, there's a pretty big chasm between someone who's a great scientist sometimes and actually building and scaling a meaningful commercial enterprise. So I think that's another thing that Stanford and sort of the core of Silicon Valley does, is say, okay, you're a really smart technologist or engineer scientist, but this is how you become an entrepreneur. Here's the tools, here's the ecosystem, this is what you need to do, and here are all the people who can kind of help build an ecosystem around you to scale your company. Or by the way, maybe you can't be the CEO, you got to step aside to be the chief product officer, and we'll bring in a CEO to help you scale your company. So it's that blend of skill set and mindset and capability that I think is really critical.
Now, Lauren, I mean, one topic that comes up a lot is that all around the world, governments are struggling with this youth unemployment issue. And many of them say, well, look, promoting an entrepreneurial economy is going to be the solution to the youth unemployment problem. Do you feel that way?
No, I feel very strongly against it, which seems counterintuitive in a way. I think that there's a really big difference between being an entrepreneur and being the CEO of Me Inc. So being, someone who has marketable skills independently, freelance, that kind of thing. And I think that the mistake that's often made is that governments or society in general tell students if you can't find a job, go start a company, be an entrepreneur. It's like it's a buzzword. It's sexy right now. But being an entrepreneur is an incredibly, you need a very, very specific skill set and mindset and all of that to be successful. I think what they should be saying is the opposite. Become the CEO of Me Inc. Become a person that, if you can't find a job, you have marketable skills that you can sell at a contract or temporary basis, so that you will always be employed regardless of whether you are long-term employed with an organization or with many organizations over the span of your career.
And so, I mean, what would need to happen in Canada to facilitate that kind of solution to the youth unemployment problem?
It's incredibly nuanced. I mean, I think that a big part of the problem is that universities are going through an identity crisis, and so is that controversial possibly? But if you ask a student, a high school student or their parents, why are you going to university? They'll say it's to get a job. And if you ask the marketing department of the various universities in this country, why should a student come to your institution, they will quote off stats that they have somehow that say that 90-something% of their students are employed within 6 months. Which I can tell you more about those stats after. But if you ask the professors on the campuses, what are you there to do? They will say it's to educate, it's to to share learning, to build thought leaders, but definitely not to help students get jobs. And so I don't think that universities are necessarily equipping students with the right tools or to help them learn about how to succeed in the economy and in the workforce. Now, I think that that's okay if we're being honest with students that are going into that environment, but I don't think that that's what's happening today at all.
Katherine, I can see you nodding in agreement. Is that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm just thinking of all the tech companies. This is why there's such a huge opportunity for a lot of the ed tech companies. There's these amazing companies I'm sure you're familiar with, like General Assembly and, my goodness, Coursera, all these. There's just sort of this plethora of platforms now that have been created for, there's Khan Academy on one side, right? But it's basically for students and people at any age to take education into their own hands and go, okay, I want to get to there, so I'm just going to take this course, that course, this course, and cobble it together, and I'm going to get there. We have a company in our portfolio called Hot Chalk as well, and it's basically for professional certifications, and they have I think it's a 95% graduation rate, and these are 1 or 2 year programs, all online, and it's anyone who comes out the other end, it's in areas where they will both get a promotion, but also a bump in income. So you can sort of see the direct impact on the economy of the country because of what they're doing. So absolutely,
And so, Ilse, any reaction from you? Are the people who are coming to you, do you think a lot of them are just saying, oh, well, what else can I do? I'm going to become an entrepreneur?
Well, there's no question that interest in entrepreneurship is exploding on campuses everywhere, and that's true across Canada, actually. And to me, that's a good thing in the sense that I look at it as entrepreneurial skills are problem-solving skills, and I think I totally agree that there's a gap between having those skills and actually having a lovely experience as a first-time entrepreneur. And I do think we kid ourselves by giving students, small grants and pretending that they're all going to be successful entrepreneurs tomorrow. They would have a much better experience of that apprenticeship art of entrepreneurship by joining a high-potential young company and just learning or going through some of these other structured programs. The other policy challenge I have is, I think we equate the tech entrepreneur today with the 19-year-old obnoxious male college dropout, which is just not borne out by the data. The average age that people start companies in the US is 39. So most successful entrepreneurs still go and have some kind of a job experience where they learn about markets and then, and then identify a problem that they want to solve. And so I think we have to, we have to balance this entrepreneurial energy and make sure we harvest it. Our businesses have to invest more in giving first-time employees an opportunity to learn on the job. We have to encourage entrepreneurs at all stages of development. And I think in the final analysis, we also have to deal with a much more fundamental question, which is people who graduate from university today will have skills that will need to continue to be changed and upgraded. And how do we create a much more flexible and adaptable system where people can come back and recharge and relearn and migrate, because they will have so many different jobs over their lifetime, rather than in the last century where you could pretty much bank on your university degree to be useful for several decades.
Now, before we go over to the audience, I wanted to ask you briefly about another area that Mars is involved in, social entrepreneurship, and to what extent the ecosystem is there to help social entrepreneurs actually succeed, and do they offer, in some ways, a different path to employment for young people?
Yeah, I think just as we've seen an explosion in technology entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship among young people is exploding, around the world, and I think that's a great thing. The today's generation of social entrepreneurs are probably different from 20 years ago when you worked for a nonprofit for nothing. These young entrepreneurs expect to make a decent living and change the world all in one go. Most of them are offside with CRA rules and don't care. So I think this, either for-profit businesses or nonprofits with a highly revenue-generating approach to tackling some of society's challenges is a hugely viable path. Young people are interested in that, just as they are looking for real jobs with that kind of a flavor as well. And I think the opportunity for us as a country is how do we harness that? Because frankly, these are extraordinary young people who really are committed to their communities, who are committed to tackling some of our most challenging problems. And we need to do everything we can, and I know you've been involved in social finance just as I have, to put wind in their sails and help them succeed, because they're a critical piece of our ability to sustain ourselves as not just an economically viable society, but also one that can deliver on what we value as Canadians.
So just a shameless aside and plug for a report I worked on, which Mars was the Canadian private sector representative for the G8, which was published in September, on impact investing, which is investing that tries to achieve a financial return and a social outcome at the same time. The report is called The Invisible Heart of Markets, and I do recommend it to everyone here, because I know Canada had quite a significant input into the recommendations, and there is also a national report on what could be done here in Canada to help that happen.
Yeah, and just actually one of the areas that might be of interest to this audience where we see, I talked about life sciences as being one of our interesting areas where we lack risk capital. What we're seeing is some of the disease-based foundations, for example, heart and stroke, some of the ones that you generously give money to, are shifting from just making grants to researchers to looking at how can they invest in a young diagnostics company and using some of their social finance capacity in their foundations to support some of these areas. So they are actually fundamentally also important in areas like energy, like healthcare, like education, as a new source of capital to foster and fund innovation.
Katherine, just briefly, if someone wanted to get in touch with C100, when would be the right time in their development as an entrepreneur to come to you, and how would they find you, and how would you decide whether to help them or not?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think that's not always totally clear. So we aren't really the hey, I really, like you were talking about, I love the idea of entrepreneurship, tell me how to go about even figuring out an idea. That's not us. We're the step beyond that you've kind of figured out the market opportunity, you've got maybe some sort of MVP, minimal viable product, you're kind of starting, you got your founding team together, and now you want to kind of take it from there. We have a program called 48 Hours in the Valley that's sort of targeted towards that group of folks. They just come to our website. All the information's there. It's thec100.org.
Great. So let's have some questions from the audience right down the front here. Let's start with. Yeah, the mic's just coming, I think, just down here. And please do say who you are. Yeah, it's on, I think.
Hello. Hi. I'm George Dejopoulos, Department of Economics at York University, and guess who I have a question for? Actually, I agree with you. I agree with you 100%, Lauren. And as a recent graduate program director in the Department of Economics, I'm focusing a lot more time and resources in trying to get our students to get jobs at the graduate level, master's and PhD. Now, and I understand there's always a lag between what universities teach their students and what's needed in the workplace. If you could, from your experience and in seeing what students lack coming out of university, is there something that we could be assisting them with? I know it could vary across discipline and sectors, but if there's any one aspect of it, analytical skills, which we try and teach, but anything beyond that.
So first of all, I'm an econ grad. I don't know if you read that yet. So I thought I might get in trouble there. First of all, I want to say that I'm not sure it's the university's responsibility to provide job prep. So that I want to be clear is that when I'm saying that the marketing department is saying that there's going to be job prep and then there's not actually that there, that might be okay. It may not be the university's role to do that. That being said, I think that some of the things that are happening in the business departments on the very same campuses, like for example at Schulich at York, there are some great programs that students get involved with where they have sort of industry connections. Employers come to campus and meet with students. There are mock interviews. There are different ways to experience different career paths. We try to facilitate a lot of that on TalentEgg. That's really what we've tried to do, is fill that gap. I think the biggest problem, and this is why it's kind of a nuanced situation, is that a lot of the times the reason that a student chooses not to go into a business or engineering program is because they're not 100% sure what they want to do yet, and they're maybe not at the maturity level. They're not ready to make a decision or to approach their career in a serious way yet. So the problems that we hear a lot is that yes, in a business program, they'll set up some sort of session. It'll be sold out. All the students will show up. They'll be wearing suits. They're very professional. Same thing happens in arts and science and wherever it is, social sciences, and they can't get anybody to come, or they can't get very many students to come. I think it's still important not to give up. I think it's still important to have those sessions, because there are different tiers and groups of students and different maturity levels that they get to through their 4 or 6 or whatever years with you. So.
Another question. Yeah, over there.
Oh, can I just answer? I actually have a perspective on that too, if it's helpful. I'm just seeing a lot of early stage entrepreneurs come through, and sort of things that I see working and not working so well. I think a basic skill set around sort of negotiation and communication skills generally. I mean, frankly, I think that should go all the way back to high school, personally. I think programs around, and this is again, technology. We're a technology firm, so that's going to be my bias. We did clean tech and life sciences, but don't do it anymore. I think the next generation programs around things like data analytics, so not analytical skills, but actually how do you, data science, and those types of programs are really important. I think having co-op programs, I think Waterloo absolutely does it right. You can sit in a class and learn about business, but until you're actually on the ground learning about how, I think that makes all the difference in the world, the context, the actual co-op program. Those are just a few other ideas.
Well, I think we should move on to another question. But
my name is Bob Lank. Just an observation, I'd be interested in the panel's reaction. I have a good friend and colleague down in the US, professor, who characterizes graduates coming out of Canadian educational institutions as being prepared to be CEOs. Rightly or wrongly. He says that in the United States, people coming out of the colleges there are being prepared to be business owners and founders. Comment?
Interesting.
What do you think of that, Catherine?
I think that's a really interesting, I guess that probably goes back to the comment I was making about being entrepreneurial, right? That there's, people ask me all the time, how do I get into venture capital, or how do I start a company, or how do I do X, Y, Z? There's really no silver bullet, right? And what I see a lot of down in Silicon Valley is that people just scrap their way to wherever it is they want to go, right? You want to start a company here, okay, they're going to do whatever it takes to get the funding, build the team, build the product to get there. And so I think that again, I've seen in the last 5 years a big change here, but that continuing to really enforce that mindset here, that you just scrap your way to, incredibly entrepreneurial, kind of take over the world in terms of resources, building the ecosystem around you, and scrap your way to being the owner of the business or the founder of whatever entity, enterprise it is that you want to create. I mean, you own your destiny in that respect, right?
There's a question there in the middle. And I would say, just because we have a lot of women up on stage doesn't mean that women can't ask questions from the audience.
Hello. Hi. This is a question just directed towards Katherine specifically. What would you say would be the reason as to why valuations of companies in the United States for startups are very different than that of in Canada? And I watch a lot of the Dragon's Den, and from the UK version to Canada to Shark Tank, and I see a massive difference in valuation. I've also experienced it in the real world, but I really did notice there's a huge difference in valuations for businesses. And
yeah, there's a lot of money, and it's incredibly competitive. And just so you know, this year, in the first 3 quarters, $24 billion was raised by venture and private equity firms in the US. All of last year entirely was about $18 billion. $24 billion is ready down mostly in Silicon Valley to be piled into companies across all stages. And it is unbelievably competitive. We have this interesting co-opetition situation with all of our brethren on Sand Hill Road where we have to follow on to each other's investments, but we want to be the first ones in to own the most that we can of the company. So that's it. Ton of money, it's super competitive.
Another question? So, I mean, do you think that ultimately Canada will have its own Sand Hill Road equivalent?
You mean in terms of investing, investors?
In terms of that whole super competitive culture of firms that are trying to invest in the best and brightest to create businesses that are going to go and dominate the world.
I think Canada's going to have its own version of it. I think it's just harder. I mean, there's, we're 1/10 the size of the U.S., and as Ilse said, we're really spread out in Canada. So I think it's going to look a little different, but I think that there's absolutely especially between the Toronto and Waterloo corridor, I think that this is just an area where there's absolutely going to be high quality global technology companies created, and I want to see more than just one.
Yeah, I think it will be a made in Canada version, but we've got a long way to go in terms of a cohort of investors that are prepared to kind of deal with these emerging companies, but also with the breakthrough technologies, which you can't tick all the boxes that the market is clear and the technology will work. So. There's a very big difference, and I spent some time in venture capital. There's a very big difference in the genealogy of Canadian venture capital. Most of the Canadian fund managers have come out of financial services. In the Valley, they came out of being entrepreneurs.
That's different, though, with the new generation. That's the thing with Real and Inovia and Bohr's version 1. That's the big shift, is that these guys are former operators, former entrepreneurs themselves, and that's really critical.
Now, you've just done your first investment in Canada. Can you just tell us a bit about that company, why you picked it, and also is there anything distinctively Canadian about it?
Well, aside from the fact they benefit from SR&ED, the tax credits up here, I mean, yeah, it's, so actually Michael Litt, who's the founder and CEO of Vidyard, which went down to Y Combinator, he is connected to all the YC network, and his comparison is that he can actually build and scale his company for about a third the cost compared to his cohort in Silicon Valley. So there's less money here, but it actually, most areas outside of Vancouver, frankly, it's actually way less costly to build and scale your company here in Canada. So yeah, the cost, with including all the tax credits and additional kind of credits you get from the government here, is a bonus. It's a company called Build Direct. It's in Vancouver. It's a data and tech-enabled platform in the heavyweight product improvement industry, like flooring, siding, that kind of thing. The CEO, Jeff Booth, is incredibly compelling. The company's been growing very quickly. It's now in the 9-digit millions of revenue. And they're literally leveraging data and tech to completely wipe out all the traditional middle people that sit between like the Home Depots of the world and the suppliers. So they take data and send it back direct to manufacturers, which improves manufacturing efficiencies in terms of what SKUs to make and what amounts, where to deliver those in North America, because conversions go up the closer you are with heavyweight products to the end consumer. And it's massive. It's a $500 billion industry. So very, very excited about that company.
Great. Well, and our time is pretty much up. I just wanted each of you to say if there was one thing that you would like to see happen in the next year that would help improve the ecosystem for innovation and investing in big ideas, what would that one thing be? And maybe I'll start with you, Lauren.
Oh, I don't have an answer ready. I'm going to pass for while
okay,
I think.
We'll come back to you. Ilse,
Okay.
We'll come back to you.
I think we have to have a much more, a much more statement from all of our leaders, from business, big business, small business, the investment industry, the Ed Clarks of the world, government leaders, that this is actually a critical piece of our future, and celebrate and acknowledge it as a key piece. It's still pretty much absent from our discourse to a large extent.
Katherine.
Yeah, I really think it's just kind of stepping off what Ilse said. It's really banding together to swing for the fences, to innovate, to go big, to not just sell off the companies, especially the tech companies, early, and also to share our success stories. Those 3 companies that I named at the beginning of the panel, I tell my colleagues about those companies that they're Canadian in the US, and they don't believe me. I'm like, no, here's the proof. On Wikipedia, they're Canadian companies. So we need to share our success stories in Canada with the world.
Yeah, I would say that I've had a really positive experience, so it would be hard for me to think of, a big thing that needs to change. And I would say that me and the entrepreneurs, I have this kind of like cohort of entrepreneurs. We all started around the same time. A lot of them have gone on to do incredible things with the companies they started then and the new ones that they've done since then. So I'm feeling very positive about it in general.
I was hoping you were going to say, hopefully someone in the audience will come up and fund my next stage of expansion. But anyway, on that note, I'd like to thank the panel again for being very thought-provoking and inspiring.